Bonjour et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. Je m'appelle Renaissance and welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to be talking about misogynoir, which is the intersection of feminism and racism that is faced by Black women. So misogynoir comes from the word misogyny, which is the hatred and violence done unto women. And noir, like from my first video, or my first pro-Black video, is Black in French, and so when you put them together you have like Black misogyny, which is the explicit violence and gendered and racial hatred that is done onto Black women specifically. So the earliest text that I have read, although I'm sure there are many, that kind of talks about some of the first observations of misogynoir, for me, is the speech Ain't I Woman by Sojourner that she gave in 1851. There is a book, Ain't I a Woman. I have not read it, I've only read the speech, but the speech is stunning and profound, and I cannot recommend reading it enough. It's a quick read, so, and there's a public PDF, so I really recommend reading it. I actually, you know what, I'll link it in the description so you can have it right there, like, please read it. And so that speech was given in 1851, but the term intersectionality was not coined until 1889 by Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black woman and author. So a long time, over a century, of Black women experiencing misogynoir, but there not being the explicit term intersectionality until the late 80s, which I find really interesting. With misogynoir, which is women and femmes, and specifically Black women and femmes, there comes with that the additional layering of transphobia and homophobia. So if you are a sapphic or a lesbian, such as myself, and you're femme and Black, that is going to create a specific type of discrimination that I face and that other Black lesbian femmes face. You are a trans woman and you're a Black trans woman, that in itself is going to create a specific type of misogynoir that can be excluded, I think, in a lot of conversations, not only about facing anti-Blackness, but also in facing sexism. And if we only address the sexism that white women face, which is done in white feminism, then you are excluding a lot of people from the conversation that have a very real relationship with sexism, but that is also tied to their racial experience and racism. So just like if you only talk about how racism and anti-Blackness affects Black men, you are leaving out a big part of the conversation. If you only talk about how sexism affects white women or affluent women, then you are leaving out a large part of the conversation about how that affects trans women, non-binary femmes, and Black women in all of those categories. I think it's really important to talk about intersectionalism and explicitly misogynoir, and they have very deep roots. So in the speech Ain't I a Woman by Sojourner you have this really brilliant depiction of the separation and of the not misconceptions, but how sexism not only affects people through gender lines, but also through racial lines. So she talks about how white women are seen as fragile and needing of constant protection by the patriarchy. And that image of white women being fragile within itself is constraining, right? Because women are not inherently more fragile than men and are not needing of more protection than men. And that in itself harms men, right? Because they're seen to be this unreachable level of toughness that is the epitome of masculinity that is unrealistic. But that grace of fragility is not given to Black women of the same era who were enslaved at the time, who were beaten and brutalized and exploited to the same extent as Black enslaved men, but Black women in that environment were not seen as fragile, whereas white women were seen as fragile. And for white women, in terms of their sexuality, are seen as pure and innocent and needing of preservation, and they're not allowed to have sexual liberty in that sense, or sexual freedom for white women. But Black women and their relationship with sexuality is that they are hypersexualized to the point of being victims of sexual violence through rape and genital mutilation and other things, and they're seen as to be over-sexualized just for simply existing as Black women, regardless of their own sexuality. And in that case, their sexual freedom is taken away from them, right, through sexual violence. Not to say that white women did not face sexual violence, but there were different structures that affected the two groups of women differently. And both of these are results of sexism, but you can see that misogynoir has violent ties to it. That makes it a different form of sexism, because if you only talked about feminism as combating this idea of female fragility, then you're leaving out conversations of Black women where they were not seen as fragile, but actually the opposite. This also ties into the medical field that we see today. So many of the procedures, many of the medical findings that are still used today come from the medical practices that were done in the era of slavery, that were done onto enslaved women, Black women, without anesthetic. And that's just like the tip of the iceberg of the brutality that was put onto Black women. And this has been seen, and medical studies, tests for prescription drugs are often done with very few Black people in them. And then there is this spread that it affects Black people differently than white people, when if you only have like 3 Black people in a study, that's not going to be very representative of how all Black people are going to react to a certain drug or procedure or treatment. So you have things like that. That also affects women. So men are often the demographic for prescription drug testing that is also prescribed to women, but women are not a part of the study. So how can you know that, for example, different levels in certain hormones such as testosterone or estrogen is going to affect the effectiveness of a drug if you don't have gender diversity? And on top of that, if you have so few Black people, and then you take those few Black people to paint all of the Black community, that's not very representative of that drug. So Black women are going to be harmed by either lack of racial diversity or in-depth look as to how medical practices affect Black people. And then they're also going to be hurt by the lack of gender diversity and medical testing. And that stems from the enslaved times into present, and it has morphed and shaped in different ways that are always going to harm Black women the most, and specifically Black trans women, because if you have prescription drugs that are not taking into consideration the different type of experiences or different types of medication that trans people may be taking, if you're not taking into the full scope, but Black trans women and Black trans men do need these prescriptions, but there is no research done on how that interacts with other drugs or other prescriptions that are synonymous with the trans medical experience, then they're going to be harmed in that way. And this is all a part of the layering, that only talking about one form of discrimination or one oppressive system at a time is not going to fully address. And so you have these continual paintings as Black women as hyper-violent, louder, more sexualized, more mature than white women and girls and are seen as supposedly more sexually active at a younger age. These are real misconceptions perpetrated through the media. And then what happens is that you have Black girls experiencing sexual violence at a younger age than their white femme counterparts. It's not that sexism does not affect white women, but it is that the sexism that specifically affects Black girls and women is going to be inherently different and often end in more violence than the sexism that is faced by white women. Not to say that it is a lighter burden, but to only talk about the sexism that affects white women is going to leave out a large part of the conversation, and you're never going to be able to dismantle the patriarchy that even harms white women if you're not also taking down the structures of white supremacy, because they go hand in hand. So if you are only talking about white women and their liberation, you're actually never going to achieve that liberation unless you also dismantle white supremacy. And only focusing on white women is still perpetrating white supremacy that is never going to give them liberation. So that's how that goes. Even within trans misogyny, if you are a lesbian and or trans, or lesbian and trans and a Black femme, then, and a Black woman, then that is inherently going to create a specific layering of discriminations. It's like really important to have these conversations, and why, for me, anti-discrimination laws don't have the punch that they need to have, because if you're waiting for one community to get quote-unquote anti-discrimination laws at a time, then you're always excluding other members of that community. So for like the Civil Rights Act and anti-discrimination laws based off of race and even gender for women always have excluded Black trans women until 2020, and have always excluded Black queer people until 2020. So what did those anti-discrimination laws actually do? And you have the law, for example, or the passing of Loving v. Virginia that allowed for interracial marriage. But same-sex marriage was not recognized at the federal level until 2015 in the United States. So even though you had Loving v. Virginia that supposedly allowed for interracial marriage, until you had marriage equality, Black people were still not allowed to marry whoever they wanted, even for racial reasons and for gendered reasons. So anti-discrimination laws do not address intersectional issues. And there's a relationship between culture and the laws and legislation that is passed. So if you pass legislation, but the culture does not respond to that legislation, then you're never going to get progress. And you cannot have the full cultural progress unless you dismantle the ties of the past and pass new legislation that reflects the morals and understandings and ethics of the present. And we have yet to see a government and law that fully addresses intersectional issues. We're starting to have those conversations now, so I think that's really interesting. And for me, misogynoir is the center of what I talk about for myself, because I'm always going to be a Black femme. That is the center of everything that I do. And with that comes my lesbian identity, and me being a gay Black woman. And then in terms of how I view politics outside of myself, which I think is important for everyone, I think everyone's center of politics should be Black trans women, because if we're not looking at how legislation and dialogues and conversation and media representation are affecting Black trans women, then you're never going to have the progressive conversation and the progress that is needed in order to have a fully liberated populace in society. Dismantling systems that allow and the normalization of both gendered and racial violence to exist at the same time, or to exist at all, but in order to exist at the same time, is really, really important for me in terms of what am I looking at in the movement. In terms of what I look for specifically and what I can explicitly educate myself on to not overwhelm myself and actually have meaningful education and dialogue on topics, for me it is about the intersectionism, or the intersectionism of queerness, Blackness, and femininity, and what that means, and how that is exerted in culture and society, and what effects come from that, and many of the roots in that, when are layered, will end up and result in higher levels of violence and exploitation for the people who fall into these demographics, such as myself. So I think it is really, really important to have these conversations and to come back to that and to center that in talks and in movements that are supposedly addressing the liberation of these individual communities. What are we doing for the people who exist in all of those communities at once? For feminist movements, if you're not addressing misogynoir, then that feminism isn't really going to get you anywhere. And you need the inclusion of trans and non-binary femmes, trans women and non-binary femmes, in order to have a well-rounded form of feminism. So I just filmed all of that. I hope you liked that. This is now 3 pro-black videos in a row. I really, really like making them, and this I probably will continue. People seem to really be liking them. You guys are watching these videos. You guys are watching these videos longer than any of my other videos, which is encouraging. I'm thinking about possibly starting a show and movie review series on here as well, because those are also some of my passions and things that I really like talking about, and I like to share that. But also I am very keen on representation and storytelling and intersectional storytelling within the media and shows that I watch. So I think that that could be fun to kind of tie into talking about being pro-black and intersectionalism on this channel, because that's another thing that I love. And I love to talk about representation and just TV and film. If you guys are interested in that, please, please, please let me know. And I will hope to see you guys in the next video. I hope you have a great day or afternoon, evening, whenever you're watching this. Thank you. Bisous and ciao.